I was 28 years old when I discovered that everything I thought I knew about my family was a carefully constructed lie. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in October, when the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves through my kitchen window, and my coffee had grown cold in the mug I'd been clutching for the past hour. The phone call that shattered my world came from a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end would change everything. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until that morning, I believed my mother was dying of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. For 18 months, I had watched her waste away, her once vibrant auburn hair falling out in clumps, her emerald green eyes growing dim with what I thought was the approach of death. I had rearranged my entire life around her illness, moving back to my childhood home in suburban Connecticut to care for her, putting my marketing career on hold, and spending my savings on alternative treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. The house where I grew up still smelled the same, a mixture of vanilla candles and the lavender fabric softener my mother had used for as long as I could remember. The hardwood floors creaked in all the familiar places, especially the third step from the bottom of the staircase, which would groan under even the slightest pressure. Every morning, I would wake to the sound of birds chirping in the oak tree outside my childhood bedroom window, the same room where I'd spent countless hours dreaming of my future. That future had seemed so clear once. I had been climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm in Manhattan, living in a cozy studio apartment in Brooklyn, and dating Marcus, a kind-hearted architect who made me laugh until my sides ached. We had talked about marriage, about buying a house with a garden where we could grow tomatoes and herbs, about having children who would run through sprinklers on summer afternoons. But when my mother called me that day in March of the previous year, her voice shaking as she delivered the devastating news, none of that mattered anymore. She had told me she had maybe 6 months to live, that the cancer had spread throughout her abdomen, and that she wanted to spend her remaining time with family. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making my knees buckle. I remember sinking onto my apartment's tiny balcony, the March wind whipping my hair across my face as I tried to process what she was telling me. The sounds of Brooklyn traffic seemed muted, as if the world had suddenly been wrapped in cotton. My mother's sobs echoed through the phone, each one cutting through me like glass. Without hesitation, I had given my boss 2 weeks' notice, broken my lease, and moved home. Marcus had been understanding, promising to visit every weekend and to support whatever decision I made. He held me as I packed my belongings, his strong arms wrapped around me as I cried into his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of cedar and soap. The months that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, chemotherapy sessions that left my mother retching into a plastic basin, and endless nights spent holding her hand as she drifted in and out of restless sleep. I learned to cook her favorite foods, even when she could barely keep down a few spoonfuls of chicken broth. I read her mystery novels aloud in the afternoons, my voice growing hoarse as I tried to distract her from the pain that seemed to consume her body. My mother, Patricia Mitchell, had always been a force of nature. At 58, she had been the kind of woman who could organize a church fundraiser, tend to her prize-winning rose garden, and cook a 7-course dinner for 20 people, all while wearing heels and never breaking a sweat. Her laugh was infectious, a deep, melodious sound that could fill a room and make even strangers smile. She had raised me and my younger brother Daniel as a single mother after our father died in a car accident when I was 12, and she had done it with a strength and grace that I had always admired. Daniel lived in California, working as a software engineer for a tech startup that demanded 60-hour weeks and frequent travel to Asia. He visited when he could, flying in for long weekends that were never long enough. I could see the guilt in his dark brown eyes, so similar to our father's, whenever he had to leave again. He would hug me tightly at the airport, his voice thick with emotion as he promised to come back soon. During those 18 months, I watched my mother's body change in ways that broke my heart. Her once curvy figure became skeletal, her clothes hanging loose on her shrinking frame. Her hands, which had once been strong enough to knead bread dough and gentle enough to braid my hair, became thin and fragile, the veins standing out like blue rivers beneath paper-thin skin. When she walked, she moved slowly, one hand pressed against the wall for support, her breathing shallow and labored. The medical bills were astronomical. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments we tried cost thousands of dollars each month. I drained my savings account, cashed out my retirement fund, and took out a second mortgage on the house. Marcus offered to help, but I couldn't bear the thought of burdening him with our family's crisis. The stress was already putting a strain on our relationship, with our weekend visits becoming increasingly infrequent as my mother's condition seemed to worsen. I became an expert in the language of cancer, learning terms like metastasis and palliative care, understanding the difference between good days and bad days by the color in my mother's cheeks and the steadiness of her voice. On good days, she would sit in her favorite recliner by the living room window, the afternoon sunlight streaming across her face as she watched the neighborhood children walk home from school. On bad days, she wouldn't leave her bedroom, and I would bring her meals on a tray, most of which would go untouched. The house itself seemed to reflect her illness. Flowers that she had once tended with obsessive care began to wither and die. The kitchen, which had always been the heart of our home, filled with the sounds of cooking and laughter, became quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional beep of the microwave heating another bowl of soup. Even the family photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to lose their vibrancy, as if the happiness captured in those moments was being leached away by the shadow of impending loss. I found myself taking long walks through our neighborhood in the evenings, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of illness that had settled over our home like a thick blanket. The familiar streets of my childhood, lined with maple and oak trees whose leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson each fall, provided a small measure of comfort. I would walk past the house where my best friend Jenny had lived, past the corner store where I had bought penny candy with my allowance, past the park where I had learned to ride a bike and had my first kiss at age 16. Sometimes I would call Marcus during these walks, my voice catching as I told him about my mother's latest symptoms or a particularly difficult night. He would listen patiently, offering words of comfort and encouragement, but I could hear the distance growing between us. The life we had planned together seemed like something that had happened to someone else, a dream that had been interrupted by the harsh reality of illness and impending death. As winter turned to spring and spring gave way to summer, my mother's condition appeared to stabilize somewhat. There were more good days, days when she would insist on helping with household chores or would ask me to drive her to the grocery store so she could pick out her own food. These improvements gave me hope, made me believe that perhaps we had more time than the doctors had initially predicted. But there were also troubling signs that I couldn't ignore. Sometimes I would catch her on the phone, speaking in hushed tones that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. When I asked who she had been talking to, she would claim it was a wrong number or a telemarketer. There were also the mysterious appointments that she insisted on attending alone, claiming they were routine follow-ups that didn't require my presence. I began to notice other inconsistencies as well. Medical bills that didn't seem to match the treatments she claimed to be receiving. Prescription bottles that appeared to be full when they should have been empty. Test results that she would receive in the mail but would quickly hide away before I could see them. When I questioned these things, she would become defensive, accusing me of not trusting her or of being overly paranoid. The tension in our house grew thick and uncomfortable, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Our conversations became stilted and careful, each of us watching the other for signs of conflict. I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid that any stress might worsen her condition, while she seemed to be hiding something that grew larger and more obvious with each passing day. It was during this time that I began to notice changes in her behavior that had nothing to do with her supposed illness. She had always been organized, but now she seemed obsessed with paperwork, spending hours at the kitchen table with documents spread before her. When I offered to help, she would quickly gather everything up, claiming it was just bills or insurance forms that she needed to handle herself. One afternoon in late September, while she was napping, I discovered a folder hidden in her bedroom closet that contained copies of her will and estate planning documents. My hands trembled as I read through them, my heart racing with the fear that she was preparing for the end. But what I found confused me even more than it frightened me. The documents were recent, dated just a few weeks earlier, and they showed significant changes from the will I had seen years before. In the original will, which I had witnessed her signing when I was in college, her assets were to be divided equally between Daniel and me. But these new documents showed a very different picture. The house, her savings accounts, and her retirement funds were now being left entirely to Daniel, while I was to receive only her personal jewelry and furniture. The reasoning given in the documents stated that because Daniel lived far away and had his own life to manage, he would need the financial security more than I would, since I had been living in the family home and managing her affairs. The words on the page blurred as tears filled my eyes. After everything I had sacrificed, after giving up my career and my relationship with Marcus, after spending every day for the past year and a half caring for her, she was cutting me out of her will. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped them. For the rest of that day, I moved through the house like a ghost, unable to look my mother in the eye, unable to trust my voice not to break if I tried to speak. When she asked if everything was all right, I managed to nod and mumble something about being tired. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. The radiator in the corner hissed softly, and somewhere in the walls, I could hear the scratching of what was probably a mouse. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows and sent leaves scraping across the roof. I tried to make sense of what I had discovered. Perhaps she was angry with me for something I had done or failed to do. Perhaps she felt that Daniel deserved more because he had worked so hard to build his career while I had put mine on hold. Or perhaps the illness had affected her thinking, making her paranoid or confused about my motivations for caring for her. But deep in my heart, I knew that none of these explanations felt right. My mother had always been sharp, even during the worst days of her illness. Her mind was clear, and her decisions were deliberate. If she had changed her will, she had done so for reasons that I couldn't understand or accept. The next few weeks passed in a haze of resentment and confusion. I continued to care for her, bringing her meals, driving her to appointments, and sitting with her during the long evenings, but something fundamental had changed between us. I found myself watching her more carefully, looking for signs of the woman who could make such a cruel decision while accepting my devoted care. It was during one of these periods of observation that I began to notice things that should have been obvious much earlier. Her appetite, which had supposedly been diminished by chemotherapy, seemed quite healthy when she thought I wasn't watching. I caught her eating a full sandwich in the kitchen one morning, quickly hiding it when I walked in. Her energy levels, which should have been depleted by cancer treatments, seemed remarkably high during phone conversations with friends when she thought I was out of earshot. Most telling of all were the physical signs that I had attributed to cancer but that now seemed questionable. The weight loss that had been so dramatic in the early months had stabilized, and she actually seemed to be gaining weight back. Her hair, which had supposedly fallen out from chemotherapy, was growing back faster than it should have if she was still receiving treatment. Her skin, which had been pale and waxy during the worst periods, now had a healthy color that belied the image of a dying woman. But it wasn't until that Tuesday morning in October when the phone rang that all of these observations crystallized into a truth so shocking that I could barely comprehend it. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, nursing my coffee and staring out at the backyard where my mother's neglected garden was slowly being reclaimed by weeds, when the phone rang. The number on the caller ID was unfamiliar, and I almost didn't answer it. But something, perhaps intuition, or simply the desire for distraction, made me pick up the receiver. "Is this Sarah Mitchell?" The voice belonged to a woman, middle-aged by the sound of it, with a slight accent that I couldn't place. "Yes, this is Sarah. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Carrera. I'm calling from St. Mary's Hospital. I understand that your mother, Patricia Mitchell, has been telling people that she's receiving cancer treatment at our facility." My hand tightened around the phone, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the window. "Yes, she's been undergoing chemotherapy there for over a year now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling. When Dr. Carrera spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Your mother has never been a patient at our facility. We have no record of her ever receiving any treatment here, and certainly no record of her having cancer." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the coffee mug slip from my other hand, crashing to the floor and sending hot liquid splashing across my legs. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed Dr. Carrera's statement. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Your mother is not receiving cancer treatment at St. Mary's Hospital. In fact, according to our records, she's never even been seen here as a patient. I'm calling because one of our staff members mentioned that she had been using our hospital's name in conversations with local merchants, apparently to receive sympathy discounts on various purchases." The room began to spin around me, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. "But she's been going to appointments there twice a week for months. She has prescription bottles from your pharmacy. She's told me about conversations with her oncologist." "Ms. Mitchell, I think you need to sit down. Is there someone who can come over to be with you? I was already sitting, but I understood what she meant. The world I thought I knew was crumbling around me, and I was about to be buried in the rubble of 18 months of lies. Continua a historia. The conversation with Dr. Carrera lasted another 20 minutes, during which she patiently answered my increasingly frantic questions. No, there was no Dr. Harrison treating cancer patients at St. Mary's, which was the name my mother had given me for her oncologist. No, the prescription bottles I had seen could not have come from their pharmacy, as they didn't use that particular bottle design. And no, they had no record of any Patricia Mitchell ever setting foot in their cancer treatment center. When I finally hung up the phone, my hands were shaking so violently that I could barely replace the receiver in its cradle. I sat staring at the mess of broken ceramic and spilled coffee on the kitchen floor, but I couldn't bring myself to clean it up. The mundane task seemed impossible when my entire world had just been revealed to be an elaborate fiction. My mother was upstairs in her bedroom, supposedly resting after what she had claimed was a particularly difficult chemotherapy session the day before. Now I knew that wherever she had been yesterday, it hadn't been at the hospital receiving cancer treatment. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a lead weight, making me feel sick and dizzy. I forced myself to stand and walk slowly up the stairs, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. Each step seemed to echo through the house, and I found myself moving as quietly as possible, as if I were approaching a dangerous animal that might attack if startled. The familiar creak of the third step from the top seemed impossibly loud in the afternoon silence. My mother's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the soft sound of her breathing. I stood in the hallway for several minutes, trying to gather the courage to confront her with what I had learned. Part of me still hoped that there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would make sense of everything. Perhaps she had been treated at a different hospital and had simply confused the names. Perhaps Dr. Carrera had made a mistake with the records. But deep in my heart, I knew that these hopes were futile. Too many things that I had dismissed or rationalized now made perfect sense. The mysterious appointments that she attended alone. The prescription bottles that never seemed to empty. The remarkable recovery of her energy and appetite in recent weeks. The secretive phone calls and the hidden paperwork. I pushed the door open gently and stepped into her room. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting everything in a soft, golden glow that seemed to mock the darkness of what I was about to uncover. My mother was lying on her side, facing away from the door, her auburn hair spread across the pillow. From this angle, she looked peaceful, innocent, like the loving mother I had always believed her to be. "Mom?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. She stirred and turned toward me, her green eyes opening slowly. When she saw me standing there, she smiled, the same warm, loving smile that had comforted me through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. "Hello, sweetheart. I was just resting a bit. Yesterday's treatment really took it out of me." The casualness of the lie, delivered with such apparent sincerity, made my stomach churn. I walked over to the chair beside her bed, the same chair where I had spent countless hours reading to her, holding her hand during painful nights, and listening to what I thought were her final wishes and memories. "I just got a phone call from St. Mary's Hospital," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "From Dr. Elizabeth Carrera." For just a moment, so briefly that I almost missed it, I saw something flicker across my mother's face. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by a look of confusion that seemed completely genuine. "St. Mary's? I don't think I know anyone by that name there. What did they want?" "Mom, please don't make this any harder than it already is. Dr. Carrera told me that you've never been a patient there. She said you don't have cancer." The words hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and choking. My mother sat up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She reached for the glass of water on her bedside table and took a small sip before setting it down with shaking hands. "Sarah, I don't understand what you're talking about. Of course I have cancer. You've seen me through all of this. You've driven me to appointments, you've held my hair back when I was sick from the chemotherapy." But even as she spoke, I could see that she was calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much she could still conceal. Her eyes, which I had always thought were clear windows into her soul, now seemed guarded and distant. Where have you been going twice a week when you said you were getting chemotherapy? To the hospital, of course. Sarah, you're scaring me. Are you feeling all right? Which hospital? The question seemed to catch her off guard, and she hesitated just long enough for me to know that she was searching for an answer. St. Mary's, where I've always gone. Mom, I just told you that St. Mary's has no record of you ever being there. They've never heard of Dr. Harrison, your supposed oncologist. They don't even use the type of prescription bottles that you've been showing me. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. I could hear the clock on her dresser ticking, marking the seconds as my mother's entire facade began to crumble. Outside, a dog was barking somewhere in the neighborhood, and the sound seemed to come from another world, a normal world where daughters didn't discover that their mothers were capable of such elaborate deception. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet that I had to lean forward to hear her. How long have you known? The admission hit me like a slap. Even though I had expected it, had known it was true from the moment Dr. Carrera called, hearing her acknowledge the lie made it real in a way that left me breathless. I suspected something was wrong for weeks, but I didn't know for sure until this morning. She nodded slowly, her fingers pleating the edge of her blanket over and over again. I never meant for it to go this far. How far? Mom, what exactly did you mean for it to be? Because from where I'm sitting, you faked having cancer for 18 months. You watched me give up my career, my relationship, my entire life to take care of you, and you knew it was all based on a lie. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and angry tears that I wiped away with the back of my hand. My mother looked up at me, and for the first time since I had entered the room, her expression showed genuine remorse. I was lonely, Sarah. After your father died, after you and Daniel grew up and moved away, I was so lonely. The house felt empty, and I felt invisible. When I told you I was sick, you came home immediately. You cared for me, you spent time with me. I felt needed again, important again. So this was all for attention? It started that way, yes. But then it became more complicated. More complicated how? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with whether to tell me the rest of the truth. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. Daniel doesn't know. I never told him I was sick. The word struck me like lightning, illuminating everything in a harsh, sudden light. What do you mean Daniel doesn't know? I only told you. I wanted you to come home, to take care of me. Daniel has his own life, his career. I didn't want to burden him. But I've seen him here, visiting. He's been worried sick about you. He thinks I have some minor health problems, nothing serious. When he visits, I tell him I'm feeling much better. The full scope of the betrayal began to dawn on me. Not only had she faked an illness to manipulate me into caring for her, but she had specifically chosen me as her target while allowing my brother to continue his life undisturbed. The favoritism, the deliberate cruelty of it, made me feel physically ill. And the will? You changed the will to leave everything to Daniel. Her face went pale, and I knew that she hadn't expected me to discover that part of her deception. How did you know about that? I found the papers, Mom. After everything I've done, after giving up my entire life to care for you, you're leaving me with nothing but jewelry and furniture. Sarah, you have to understand. Understand what? That you manipulated me into wasting 18 months of my life while secretly planning to cut me out of your will? That you let me spend my life savings on fake medical treatments while knowing that none of it was real? I was shouting now, all the anger and betrayal that had been building for weeks finally erupting. My mother shrank back against her pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. I changed the will because I thought you would be angry when you found out about the cancer. I thought you would hate me, and I wanted to make sure that Daniel would take care of me in my old age. So this was all calculated? The fake illness, the manipulation, cutting me out of the inheritance? No, it wasn't all calculated. The cancer story started as a lie to get you to come home, but then I got scared about what would happen when you found out. I thought if Daniel inherited everything, he would feel obligated to support me, and you would be free to go back to your life. Free to go back to my life? Mom, I don't have a life to go back to. I quit my job, I broke my lease, Marcus and I are barely speaking because I haven't had time for our relationship. I've spent every penny I had on treatments that you didn't need. The enormity of what she had done to me was finally sinking in, and with it came a rage so pure and consuming that I could barely breathe. I stood up from the chair, needing to put distance between us before I said or did something I would regret. Sarah, please let me explain. I know what I did was wrong, but I can fix this. I can change the will back. I can tell Daniel the truth. You think that fixes 18 months of lies? You think that gives me back my career, my relationship, my savings? I was pacing now, unable to stand still, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The familiar room, where I had spent so many hours caring for her, now felt like a prison, a monument to my own stupidity and her betrayal. I'll pay you back every penny you spent. I have money saved, investments. I can make this right. With what money? The money you're leaving to Daniel? She had no answer for that, and we both knew it. The silence stretched between us again, filled with the weight of everything that could never be undone, all the time and love and sacrifice that had been built on quicksand. Finally, I walked to the door, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the room and her presence. Sarah, where are you going? I turned back to look at her one last time, this woman who had given birth to me, raised me, and then betrayed me so completely that I felt like I was looking at a stranger. I'm going to pack my things. I'm leaving. You can't leave. I need you here. I'm still your mother. The desperation in her voice might have moved me yesterday, but now I could hear the manipulation in it, the attempt to use guilt and obligation to control me one more time. You stopped being my mother the day you decided to fake cancer to manipulate me. You're Patricia Mitchell, a woman who lives in this house. But you're not my mother anymore. I walked out of the room and down the hall to my childhood bedroom, my legs carrying me automatically while my mind reeled with the implications of everything I had learned. Behind me, I could hear her calling my name, her voice growing more frantic, but I didn't turn around. Continua a historia. Packing my belongings felt like dismantling a life I had never really chosen. Each item I folded and placed in my suitcase represented a piece of the person I had become over the past 18 months, someone I no longer recognized or wanted to be. The marketing awards I had earned in my previous career, now gathering dust on my childhood dresser, seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. The comfortable clothes I had bought for endless days of caregiving, soft sweaters and practical shoes, felt like a uniform I was finally allowed to remove. My hands shook as I emptied the drawers that had held my things for the past year and a half. In the back of the bottom drawer, I found a photograph of Marcus and me that I had hidden there months ago, taken during our last real vacation together. We were standing on a beach in Maine, his arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting into the bright summer sun. We looked happy, carefree, like people who believed in the future. Looking at it now, I felt a grief so sharp that it took my breath away, not just for what I had lost, but for how willingly I had thrown it all away for a lie. Downstairs, I could hear my mother moving around, her footsteps echoing through the house as she called my name with increasing desperation. At one point, she appeared in the doorway of my room, her face streaked with tears, her hands clutching a handful of tissues. Sarah, please, we need to talk about this. You can't just leave. I didn't look up from my packing. Yes, I can. I'm 28 years old, and I have no legal obligation to stay here. But I'm your mother. I raised you. I love you. The word love hung in the air between us, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned to face her, and the words that came out of my mouth were sharp enough to cut. You love me? You have a funny way of showing it. If you loved me, you wouldn't have stolen 18 months of my life. If you loved me, you wouldn't have watched me spend every penny I had on treatments you didn't need. If you loved me, you wouldn't have let me destroy my relationship with Marcus while you were secretly planning to leave everything to Daniel. I can change the will. I told you I can fix this. This isn't about the money, Mom. This is about trust. This is about the fact that you looked me in the eye every single day and lied to me. You let me hold your hand through fake chemotherapy side effects. You let me read to you while you pretended to be dying. You accepted my care and my love while planning to betray me. She was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking with sobs that might have been genuine or might have been just another manipulation. I found that I didn't care anymore. The part of me that would have automatically moved to comfort her had been cauterized by betrayal. Where will you go? What will you do? I don't know. But I'll figure it out. I figured out how to take care of you for 18 months. I'm sure I can figure out how to take care of myself. I zipped up my largest suitcase and carried it to the hallway, then returned for the rest of my things. The process felt mechanical, automatic, as if I were watching someone else dismantle the remnants of a life built on lies. With each trip, my mother's pleas became more desperate, but her words seemed to reach me from a great distance, filtered through the protective numbness that had settled over me like armor. When I had loaded everything into my car, I stood in the front yard of the house where I had grown up, looking back at the place that no longer felt like home. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that had always made me feel grateful to be alive. The maple tree in the front yard was ablaze with orange and red leaves, and a few had already fallen to carpet the lawn in brilliant color. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of scene that belonged on a postcard advertising the charm of New England autumns. But all I could think about as I looked at that house was the 18 months of my life that had been stolen from me within its walls. The career I had abandoned, the relationship I had neglected, the savings I had depleted, all for a woman who had viewed my sacrifice as nothing more than convenient care while she planned my financial exile. My mother appeared on the front porch, still in her bathrobe and slippers, her hair uncombed and her face ravaged by tears. She looked older than her 58 years, fragile and broken in a way that would have moved me to pity just hours before. "Sarah, please don't do this. I know I made mistakes, but we're family. We can work through this." I got into my car and rolled down the window. For the last time, I looked directly into the green eyes that I had inherited from her, searching for some sign of the woman who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia at age 7, who had driven 3 hours to bring me soup when I was sick during my freshman year of college. But that woman was gone, if she had ever really existed. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who was capable of elaborate deception and casual cruelty, someone who could accept devoted care while secretly planning betrayal. "Goodbye, Patricia," I said, deliberately using her first name instead of calling her Mom. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, watching in my rearview mirror as she stood on the porch growing smaller and smaller until I turned the corner and she disappeared entirely. I had no destination in mind as I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the airport and catch the first flight anywhere, to disappear entirely and start over in a place where no one knew my story. But another part of me felt drawn to the places that had been important to me before my mother's lies had derailed my life. Without conscious decision, I found myself driving toward Marcus's apartment in Brooklyn. It was a 4-hour drive from Connecticut, and I had made it countless times during the first few months of my mother's supposed illness, back when I still believed that our relationship could survive the strain of her cancer. The route was so familiar that I could have driven it blindfolded, past the rest stops and toll booths that had become landmarks in my attempts to maintain some connection to my former life. As I drove, I tried to process everything that had happened in the span of a single morning. The phone call from Dr. Carrera seemed like something that had occurred in another lifetime, though it had been less than 4 hours since I learned the truth. The conversation with my mother felt surreal, like a nightmare that I kept expecting to wake up from. But underneath the shock and betrayal was something else, something that I was only beginning to recognize as relief. For months, I had been living under the crushing weight of impending loss, watching someone I loved waste away from a disease that I was powerless to stop. The grief of anticipatory mourning had been a constant companion, coloring every interaction with the knowledge that our time together was limited. Now I knew that the grief had been manufactured, that the woman I had been mourning was never in danger of dying. But strangely, this knowledge didn't eliminate the sense of loss. Instead, it transformed it into something else, something perhaps even more painful. I was mourning the mother I thought I had, the woman I had believed was brave and honest in the face of terminal illness. That woman had never existed, and her death was just as final as if cancer had actually claimed her. The sun was setting by the time I reached the outskirts of New York City, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of better times. I had always loved this drive, especially in the evening when the skyline appeared gradually through the windshield like a promise of possibility. Tonight, the familiar sight of Manhattan's lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness made my chest tight with longing for the life I had abandoned. Marcus lived in a fourth-floor walk-up in Brooklyn Heights, in an apartment with tall windows that looked out over the harbor toward the Statue of Liberty. We had spent countless evenings on his narrow balcony, watching the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline while sharing takeout Chinese food and planning our future together. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people, a couple who had believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. I parked on the street outside his building and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to gather the courage to go upstairs. I hadn't called to tell him I was coming, hadn't spoken to him in over 2 weeks. For all I knew, he had moved on, found someone who wouldn't disappear for months at a time to care for a dying mother who wasn't actually dying. The lobby of his building smelled the same as always, a mixture of coffee and old wood and the faint scent of Indian spices from the restaurant on the ground floor. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs slowly, my legs suddenly heavy with exhaustion and anxiety. By the time I reached his door, my heart was beating so hard that I could hear it echoing in my ears. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. What was I going to say to him? How could I explain 18 months of neglect, 18 months of putting my mother's needs before our relationship, when it turned out that those needs had been fictional? Before I could lose my nerve entirely, I knocked 3 times, the same pattern I had always used to let him know it was me. There was a long moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, Marcus stood there looking exactly the same as always, tall and lean with dark hair that never quite stayed in place and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a paint-stained t-shirt and jeans, and there was a pencil tucked behind his ear, suggesting that I had interrupted him while he was working on one of his architectural drawings. Sarah. He said my name like he wasn't sure I was real, like I might be a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. Hi, Marcus. We stood there looking at each other for what felt like an eternity, the hallway around us filled with the weight of everything that had changed between us. I could see the questions in his eyes, the careful hope that he was trying not to let show too obviously. Is everything okay? Is your mom? Can I come in? I need to tell you something. He stepped aside to let me pass, and I walked into the familiar space that had once felt like a second home. Nothing had changed, from the architectural sketches covering every surface to the stack of books beside his favorite reading chair to the half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table. But being there felt strange, like visiting a museum of my former life. Can I get you something? Coffee? Wine. Wine sounds good. He disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear him opening cabinets and drawers with the easy familiarity of someone moving through his own space. I wandered over to the windows that looked out over the harbor, watching the lights of Manhattan reflect on the dark water. A ferry was making its way across the harbor, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, carrying people home from work or out for evening adventures. When Marcus returned with 2 glasses of red wine, I was still standing by the window, trying to find the words to explain everything that had happened. Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on? I took a sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, then turned to face him. He was sitting on the edge of his couch, leaning forward with his hands clasped between his knees, his face creased with concern. My mother doesn't have cancer, I said simply. She never had cancer. She faked the whole thing. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched Marcus's expression change from concern to confusion to something that might have been anger. What do you mean she faked it? So I told him everything. About the phone call from Dr. Carrera, about confronting my mother, about discovering the changed will and the deliberate manipulation that had kept me trapped in Connecticut for 18 months. I told him about the prescription bottles that were never empty, about the mysterious appointments and secretive phone calls, about all the signs that I had ignored or rationalized away. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he set down his wine glass and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from stressful moments during our relationship. Jesus, Sarah. I don't even know what to say. I know it sounds crazy. I'm still having trouble believing it myself. It doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like your mother is a sociopath. The harshness of his words made me flinch, even though part of me agreed with his assessment. She's lonely, Marcus. She missed having us around, having someone who needed her. So she destroyed your life to fix her loneliness? Sarah, do you realize what you've lost because of her lies? Of course I realize it. I'm the one who lived through it. But even as I said it, I knew that I was still making excuses for her, still trying to find some way to understand or justify what she had done. The habit of protecting her, of putting her needs first, was so deeply ingrained that I couldn't seem to break it even now. Marcus stood up and began pacing around the room, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. You quit your job for her. You broke your lease, you spent your savings. You missed your promotion, the one you had been working toward for 2 years. And for what? So she could have a live-in companion who would wait on her hand and foot? I know. I know all of that. And what about us, Sarah? What about our relationship? Do you have any idea what it was like watching you disappear into that house, becoming someone I barely recognized? The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and it cut through me like glass. I had known that my absence had been hard on him, but I had convinced myself that he understood the necessity of it, that he supported my decision to care for my dying mother. I thought you understood. I thought you knew that I had to be there for her. I did understand. That's the hell of it. I understood completely, and I supported you even when it meant that our relationship became something that existed only in 10-minute phone calls and occasional weekend visits where you were too exhausted and worried to really be present. I set down my wineglass and sank into the chair across from him, suddenly feeling the weight of the day's revelations settling on my shoulders like lead blankets. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry. I'm not the one you should be apologizing to. I'm not the victim here, you are. You're the one who was manipulated and used and betrayed. But I could see the hurt in his eyes, the months of loneliness and frustration that he had endured while believing that he was being supportive of someone caring for a dying parent. The knowledge that all of his sacrifice had been as meaningless as mine didn't make it hurt less. Where do we go from here? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me directly, his expression softer now but no less serious. I don't know, Sarah. I honestly don't know. What happened to you is terrible, and I want to help you figure out how to rebuild your life. But I can't pretend that the last 18 months didn't happen, or that our relationship can just pick up where it left off. I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you realize how much damage has been done. Not just to your career or your finances, but to who you are. The woman I fell in love with was strong and independent and sure of herself. She had boundaries and self-respect and ambitions. I watched your mother systematically destroy all of those qualities, and you let her do it. His words stung because they were true. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who lived entirely in service to another person's needs, real or fabricated. The person I had been before my mother's phone call 18 months ago felt like a stranger, someone whose confidence and autonomy seemed impossible to reclaim. I don't know how to be that person again. Neither do I. And that's the problem. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything unsaid settling between us like fog. Outside the windows, the city continued its evening rhythm, people heading home from work or out for dinner, living their normal lives while mine lay in pieces around my feet. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. You can stay here tonight if you want. Or for a few days while you figure out what to do next. But Sarah, I can't be your solution to this problem. You need to figure out who you are and what you want, and you need to do it on your own. I nodded, understanding that he was right even though it wasn't what I wanted to hear. Part of me had hoped that coming here would be like stepping back into my old life, that Marcus would hold me and tell me that everything would be okay and that we could start over. But relationships didn't work that way, and people couldn't be easily put back together after being systematically taken apart. Can I ask you something? I said. Of course. Did you ever suspect? Did you ever think that something about the situation didn't add up? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Honestly? There were times when I wondered. Your mother never seemed as sick as someone with advanced cancer should be. And there were things you told me that didn't quite make sense, medical details that seemed off. But I convinced myself that I was just being selfish, that I was looking for reasons to doubt her illness because I wanted you to come home. Why didn't you say anything? What was I supposed to say? That I thought your mother was lying about having cancer? You would have thought I was a monster. And if I had been wrong, if she really had been dying and I had planted seeds of doubt in your mind, I never would have forgiven myself. I understood his position, but part of me wished that he had trusted his instincts, that someone had challenged the story I had accepted so completely. Maybe if he had asked the right questions, I would have investigated more carefully, would have discovered the truth before wasting so much time and money and emotion on a lie. But that was just another way of avoiding responsibility for my own choices. I was the one who had accepted my mother's story without question, who had ignored the inconsistencies and red flags, who had allowed myself to be manipulated for 18 months. Marcus couldn't have saved me from that, and it wasn't fair to expect him to have done so. Continua a historia. I stayed at Marcus's apartment for 3 days, sleeping on his couch and trying to piece together a plan for rebuilding my life. During the day, while he was at work, I would sit by his windows and make lists of everything I needed to do, practical things like finding a place to live and updating my resume, and emotional things like figuring out how to trust people again and learning to recognize my own needs and boundaries. The first item on my practical list was finding a job, but even that simple task felt overwhelming. My field, marketing, had changed significantly in the 18 months I had been away from it. New social media platforms had emerged, digital advertising strategies had evolved, and the contacts I had cultivated over years of networking had probably forgotten I existed. The thought of explaining the gap in my resume made my stomach clench with anxiety. What was I supposed to tell potential employers? That I had quit my job to care for a mother who wasn't actually sick? On Wednesday afternoon, while Marcus was at a client meeting, I finally worked up the courage to call my former boss, Jennifer Walsh, at the marketing firm where I had worked before my mother's fake illness derailed my career. Jennifer and I had always had a good professional relationship, and she had been understanding when I gave my 2 weeks' notice, even offering to keep my position open for as long as possible. The phone rang 4 times before Jennifer's familiar voice answered. Sarah. What a surprise. How are you? How is your mother? The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, made my throat tighten with emotion. Jennifer had been one of the few people outside my family who knew about my mother's supposed cancer, and her kindness during that difficult time had meant more to me than I had ever told her. That's actually why I'm calling, I managed to say. It's complicated, but it turns out that my mother was never actually sick. She faked the whole thing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Jennifer processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, professional. I'm not sure I understand. She faked having cancer? Yes. I found out 3 days ago that she was never receiving treatment, never had an oncologist, never had cancer at all. She made it all up to get me to come home and take care of her. Jesus, Sarah. I'm so sorry. I don't even have words for that. I know it sounds insane. I'm still trying to process it myself. What are you going to do now? The question I had been dreading, the one that had kept me awake for the past 3 nights. I need to find a job. I was hoping we could talk about the possibility of returning to the company, maybe in a different role if my old position has been filled. Another pause, this one long enough to make my palms start sweating. I knew that Jennifer had probably moved on, that my old position had been filled by someone who could commit to staying, someone who wouldn't disappear for over a year to care for a parent who wasn't actually dying. Sarah, you know I think you're incredibly talented, and under any other circumstances, I would welcome you back in a heartbeat. But the truth is, we've restructured significantly since you left. Your old position was absorbed into other roles, and we're not looking to expand the team right now. I had expected this answer, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. I understand. What about freelance work or contract positions? I'm willing to start over, to take whatever you have available. Let me make some calls and see what I can find. Can I reach you at this number? Yes, I'll have my phone with me. Good. And Sarah? I want you to know that what happened to you is not your fault. Anyone would have done the same thing if they believed their mother was dying. After I hung up, I sat by Marcus's window and watched the afternoon traffic moving slowly through the streets below. People hurrying home from work, stopping at grocery stores and coffee shops, living their normal lives filled with routine problems and everyday concerns. I envied them their ordinary difficulties, their simple schedules, their uncomplicated relationships with their families. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment I hoped it might be Jennifer calling back with good news. But the name on the screen made my stomach drop, Mom. I hesitated for several seconds before opening the message, my finger hovering over the screen as I debated whether I was ready to deal with whatever she had to say. Finally, curiosity won out over self-preservation. Sarah, please call me. We need to talk. I've been to see a lawyer about changing the will back. I want to make this right. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and sadness wash over me. Even now, even after everything that had been revealed, she was still trying to manage the situation, still trying to find some way to fix what couldn't be fixed with simple gestures like changing legal documents. I typed and deleted several responses, each one either too angry or not angry enough, too forgiving or not forgiving enough. Finally, I settled on something short and non-committal: I need more time. The response came back almost immediately: how much time? The question irritated me, the implication that my healing and my decision should operate on her schedule, that there was some reasonable timeline for getting over 18 months of manipulation and betrayal. I don't know. I'll contact you when I'm ready. This time, she didn't respond immediately, and I turned off my phone to avoid the temptation to keep checking for messages. I needed space to think, to feel, to process what had happened without the constant pressure of her need to resolve the situation on her terms. That evening, when Marcus came home from work, he found me in his kitchen attempting to make dinner from the limited ingredients in his refrigerator. I had managed to put together a simple pasta dish, nothing fancy, but the act of cooking had been therapeutic, giving my hands something to do while my mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. "How was your day?" he asked, the question casual but loaded with concern. I called Jennifer about the possibility of returning to work. She's going to make some calls, see what she can find. Marcus nodded, hanging his jacket on the back of a chair. That's good. What else? My mother texted me. She wants to talk, says she's been to see a lawyer about changing the will. What did you tell her? That I need more time. She asked how much time, like there's some kind of deadline for processing this. Marcus opened a beer and leaned against the counter, studying my face carefully. What do you want to do? I don't know. Part of me wants to talk to her, to try to understand why she did what she did. But another part of me thinks that talking to her will just give her another opportunity to manipulate me. Those aren't mutually exclusive possibilities. I looked up from the pasta I was serving, surprised by the observation. What do you mean? I mean that understanding why she did it and protecting yourself from further manipulation aren't contradictory goals. You can try to understand her motivations while maintaining clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept from her. It was a simple concept, but one that felt revolutionary after 18 months of putting her needs above my own, of accepting whatever treatment she gave me because I believed she was dying and therefore deserving of unlimited patience and forgiveness. I don't know how to have boundaries with her. I've never been good at that. Maybe that's something you need to learn. We ate dinner in comfortable silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The pasta was surprisingly good, considering the limited ingredients, and for a few minutes, I allowed myself to enjoy the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone whose company I valued. After dinner, Marcus suggested we take a walk through the neighborhood, and I agreed, grateful for the opportunity to get out of the apartment and move my body. Brooklyn Heights at night was beautiful, with its tree-lined streets and historic brownstones glowing warmly in the lamplight. We walked without talking much, just enjoying the cool evening air and the familiar rhythm of walking together. At one point, we paused at the promenade overlooking the harbor, the same spot where we had spent countless evenings during our relationship. The Manhattan skyline glittered across the water, and I could see the Statue of Liberty's torch gleaming in the distance. It was a view that had always filled me with a sense of possibility, but tonight it just made me feel small and lost. I keep thinking about all the time I wasted, I said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. It wasn't wasted if you learned something from it. What did I learn? That I'm gullible enough to fall for an elaborate lie? That I'll abandon everything important to me if someone pushes the right buttons? Marcus turned to face me, his expression serious in the lamplight. You learned that you're capable of tremendous sacrifice for someone you love. You learned that you have more strength and endurance than you realized. Those aren't negative qualities, Sarah. They're just qualities that someone took advantage of. But how do I make sure it doesn't happen again? How do I learn to trust my instincts when they were so completely wrong about something so important? I think the first step is recognizing that your instincts weren't wrong. You had doubts, you noticed inconsistencies, you questioned things that didn't add up. But you talked yourself out of trusting those instincts because you wanted to be a good daughter, because you were afraid of being selfish or suspicious. He was right, and I knew it. Looking back over the past 18 months, I could identify dozens of moments when some part of me had sensed that something was off, when my subconscious had tried to alert me to the possibility that I was being deceived. But each time, I had suppressed those feelings, had convinced myself that my suspicions were unworthy or unkind. So the lesson is to trust myself more, even when it's uncomfortable? Especially when it's uncomfortable. The truth is often uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it less true. We started walking again, making our way slowly back toward Marcus's building. As we walked, I found myself thinking about the person I had been before my mother's phone call, the woman who had been confident in her career, decisive in her relationships, and clear about her own needs and boundaries. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime, but maybe she wasn't as lost as I had thought. Maybe she was just buried under months of self-doubt and manipulation, waiting to be rediscovered. When we reached Marcus's building, he paused at the entrance and turned to me with a question in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe it would be good for you to talk to someone. A therapist, I mean. Someone who specializes in family dysfunction and manipulation." The suggestion didn't surprise me. I had been thinking the same thing, recognizing that the damage done by my mother's deception went deeper than just practical concerns like jobs and money. It had shaken my ability to trust my own judgment, to recognize and prioritize my own needs, to maintain healthy boundaries in relationships. "I think you're right," I said. "Do you know anyone?" My sister went through something similar a few years ago, not exactly the same situation, but some family issues that required professional help. She had good things to say about her therapist. "I could get you the contact information if you want." "Yes, please. I think I need all the help I can get." That night, as I lay on Marcus's couch staring at the ceiling, I thought about the journey ahead of me. It would be long and difficult, full of setbacks and moments of doubt. I would have to rebuild my career from scratch, find a place to live, learn to trust people again, and figure out how to have a relationship with my mother that didn't involve being manipulated or taken advantage of. But for the first time since Dr. Carrera's phone call had shattered my world, I felt something that might have been hope. It was fragile and tentative, like a plant pushing through concrete, but it was there. I was young, I was intelligent, I had skills and experience that couldn't be erased by 18 months of deception. Most importantly, I was finally free to make choices based on my own needs and desires rather than someone else's manipulation. The road ahead would be challenging, but it would be mine to walk. Continua a historia. The therapist Marcus's sister recommended was Dr. Rachel Sterling, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that I found immediately comforting. Her office was in a converted brownstone in Park Slope, with tall windows that let in streams of natural light and walls lined with books that looked well-read rather than decorative. The space felt safe and private, removed from the chaos of the city streets below. During our first session, Dr. Sterling listened without judgment as I told her the entire story, from my mother's initial phone call to the revelation of her deception to my current state of homelessness and unemployment. She took notes occasionally but mostly just listened, her expression reflecting understanding rather than shock or disbelief. "What you've experienced is a form of psychological abuse," she told me when I finished. Your mother used your love and sense of duty to manipulate you into providing care and attention that she wanted but didn't need. The fact that she maintained this deception for 18 months, allowing you to sacrifice your career, your relationship, and your financial security, shows a level of calculation and selfishness that's difficult to comprehend. Hearing a professional validate my feelings was both relieving and devastating. Part of me had still been holding on to the hope that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe my mother's actions could be understood or forgiven as the desperate measures of a lonely woman. But Dr. Sterling's assessment confirmed what I had been afraid to acknowledge, that what had happened to me was a serious form of abuse that had left me with real psychological wounds. The question now, Dr. Sterling continued, is how to heal from this experience and protect yourself from future manipulation. We need to work on rebuilding your sense of self, strengthening your boundaries, and helping you trust your own judgment again. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine that felt simultaneously foreign and necessary. 3 days a week, I had sessions with Dr. Sterling, where we slowly unpacked 18 months of manipulation and its effects on my psyche. The other days, I spent job hunting, apartment searching, and trying to rebuild the practical foundations of my life. Jennifer had managed to find me some freelance marketing work, small projects that paid enough to cover my basic expenses while I looked for something more permanent. The work was below my previous level, simple campaigns for local businesses that required none of the strategic thinking I had once specialized in, but it felt good to be using my professional skills again, even in a limited capacity. Finding an apartment in New York was as brutal as I remembered, made worse by the fact that my credit had taken a hit during my months of unemployment and excessive medical spending. After 2 weeks of rejections and disappointments, I finally found a tiny studio in Queens, barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it was mine and it was affordable. The day I moved in, Marcus helped me carry my few possessions up 3 flights of stairs to the small space that would be my new home. It was nothing like the life I had planned 2 years earlier, when I had imagined moving in with him, buying furniture together, creating a home that reflected our shared tastes and dreams. But as I stood in my empty studio apartment, with its single window looking out over a busy street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: independence. "It's not much," I said, looking around at the small space with its outdated fixtures and scuffed hardwood floors. "It's yours," Marcus replied, and I knew he understood the significance of that simple fact. Dr. Sterling had been working with me on recognizing and setting boundaries, and one of the most difficult exercises was deciding how and when to contact my mother. She had continued to text me regularly, her messages alternating between apologies, explanations, and increasingly desperate pleas for reconciliation. I had read each one but hadn't responded, needing time to process my feelings without the pressure of her immediate needs and demands. After a month in therapy, Dr. Sterling suggested that I might be ready to have a conversation with my mother, but with specific conditions and boundaries in place. "The goal isn't necessarily forgiveness or reconciliation," she explained. "The goal is to communicate your boundaries clearly and to get the answers you need to move forward with your healing." We spent several sessions preparing for this conversation, role-playing different scenarios and practicing phrases that would help me maintain my boundaries if my mother attempted to manipulate or guilt me. Dr. Sterling emphasized that I had the right to end the conversation at any time, to refuse to discuss certain topics, and to prioritize my own emotional well-being over my mother's comfort. On a crisp Saturday morning in late November, I drove back to Connecticut for the first time since I had left 6 weeks earlier. The familiar route felt strange now, like returning to a place I had lived in another lifetime. The autumn leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees bare and skeletal against the gray sky, and there was a bite in the air that promised winter was not far away. My mother's house looked exactly the same, down to the newspapers accumulated on the front porch and the garden that was now completely overgrown with weeds. But seeing it now, with the knowledge I had gained and the distance I had created, it looked smaller somehow, less significant than it had seemed when it was the center of my world. I sat in my car for several minutes before going to the door, reminding myself of the boundaries I had set and the questions I needed answered. Dr. Sterling had given me a list of specific things to discuss: my mother's motivations for the deception, her understanding of the harm she had caused, and her commitment to respecting my boundaries going forward. When I finally knocked on the door, my mother answered so quickly that I suspected she had been watching for me from the living room window. She looked older than she had 6 weeks ago, with new lines around her eyes and a tentative expression that suggested she wasn't sure how I would react to seeing her. "Sarah," she said, my name coming out like a sigh of relief. "Thank you for coming." I followed her into the living room, noting that she had cleaned the house thoroughly, probably in preparation for my visit. Fresh flowers sat on the coffee table, and the surfaces gleamed with polish. Even the magazines were arranged in perfect, symmetrical stacks. It was the behavior of someone who was trying very hard to make a good impression, and I recognized it as yet another form of manipulation, subtle but deliberate. We sat across from each other, she in her favorite recliner and me on the couch where I had spent so many hours reading to her during her fake illness. The silence between us was heavy with everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be addressed. "I've been seeing a therapist," I began, having decided that honesty was the best approach. "She's helping me understand what happened and how to move forward." My mother nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I think that's good. I think that's very smart of you. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. No more lies, no more stories designed to make me feel sorry for you or to minimize what you did." "Of course. I'll answer anything you want to know." Her eagerness to please was suspicious, another sign that she was still trying to manage the situation rather than genuinely confronting what she had done. But I pressed forward with my planned questions, determined to get the information I needed. "How long had you been planning this before you called me that day in March?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her calculating how much truth she could afford to tell me. "I had been thinking about it for a few weeks. I was so lonely after you moved to New York, and Daniel was so busy with his job. I missed having you around, missed being needed. When I saw a movie about a woman with cancer whose family rallied around her, I started thinking about what would happen if I got sick. So you decided to fake cancer." I decided to exaggerate some health problems I was having. I had been experiencing some stomach issues, and I convinced myself that it could be serious. But when the tests came back normal, I couldn't bear the thought of telling you that it was nothing, that you had worried for no reason. So instead of admitting that you had been mistaken, you decided to make up an entire illness. I know how it sounds, Sarah. I know how terrible it was. But once I started, I didn't know how to stop. Every day that passed made it harder to tell you the truth. I could see tears starting to form in her eyes, but I forced myself not to respond with sympathy or comfort. Dr. Sterling had warned me that my mother would likely try to evoke pity as a way of avoiding accountability for her actions. "What about the appointments you went to twice a week? Where were you really going?" "Different places. Sometimes I would just drive around, park somewhere and read a book. Sometimes I would go shopping or get my hair done. I knew I needed to be gone for the right amount of time to make it seem real." The casual way she described these deceptions made my stomach turn. While I had been at home worrying about her, researching treatment options and managing her supposed symptoms, she had been getting her hair done and running errands. And the prescription bottles? The ones that never seemed to get empty? I had them filled with vitamins. I knew someone who worked at a pharmacy who could make up bottles with the right labels. The level of premeditation involved was staggering. This hadn't been a spontaneous lie that had gotten out of control, it had been a carefully orchestrated deception involving multiple people and elaborate props. "Who else knew?" I asked. "Who helped you maintain this lie?" She hesitated, and I could see her weighing whether to protect the people who had enabled her deception. "My friend Carol knew. She's the one who worked at the pharmacy. And my sister knew, your Aunt Linda." The revelation that other family members had been involved in deceiving me felt like another betrayal, though perhaps a smaller one than the original. Aunt Linda had called me several times during the supposed illness to check on my mother and offer support, all while knowing that the entire situation was fictional. "What did you tell Daniel?" "You said he didn't know about the cancer." "I told him I had some minor health issues, nothing serious. When he visited, I made sure to seem tired and a little weak, but I never told him I was dying." So even within her deception, she had chosen me as the primary target, the child who would sacrifice everything while her son was allowed to continue his life undisturbed. The favoritism, the deliberate cruelty of it, was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire betrayal. "Why me?" I asked. "Why not tell Daniel the same story? Why choose me to manipulate? She was crying openly now, but her tears no longer moved me the way they once would have. Because I knew you would come. You were always the one who took care of people, who put family first. Daniel is more independent, more focused on his own life. I knew he would be supportive, but I also knew he wouldn't drop everything to take care of me the way you would. The honesty of this statement, the casual acknowledgement that she had deliberately targeted my compassion and sense of duty, was breathtaking in its selfishness. She had identified my strengths, the qualities that made me a good daughter and a caring person, and had weaponized them against me.